Imagine waking up on a Monday morning and finding out the federal government just authorized you to build a commercial nuclear reactor right in your startup's garage.
Just go ahead and build it.
Right, like no pre-clearance required, no government inspectors looking over your blueprints. You can just move as fast as you want.
Which sounds great
Right?
until...
Until you realize there is a catch. And it's a massive one, because if a single ounce of radiation leaks into your neighbor's yard, or if, the grid destabilizes, you don't get to blame the company that sold you the uranium.
Nope.
You are personally entirely liable for the multi-million-dollar fallout.
It's the ultimate double-edged sword, really. I mean, you get infinite velocity on the supply side, but infinite liability on the deployment side.
Exactly. And that is exactly the situation B2B SaaS founders woke up to this week. So welcome to this deep dive. If you are building software right now, you are operating in an absolute, split-screen reality.
Yeah, the whiplash is intense.
It really is. Because on one side of the screen, the U.S. federal government is systematically tearing down guardrails. They're stepping way back from frontier AI regulation and actively opening up core banking ledgers to technologists.
Right, a total green light.
But then you look at the exact opposite side of the screen. Europe and California are setting some of the most aggressive, technically complex compliance traps for the application layer that we have, ever seen in the history of software development.
The geopolitical whiplash here is just staggering. Because if you're a founder trying to write code that scales globally...
Which you have to do.
Right, which you have to do. But the foundational rules of physics governing what that code is legally allowed to do and, who is responsible when it executes are completely different depending on where the server sits and whose job your software is impacting.
So our mission today is to just cut through that noise, right? We're going to deconstruct this regulatory whiplash, and we have a massive stack of sources on the table to help us navigate this.
We really do.
We're pulling from legal memos from heavyweights like Fisher Phillips and Sullivan and Cromwell. We have this really dense cybersecurity analysis from Echelon.
That Echelon report is wild, by the way.
It is. It's fascinating. And we're also looking at investigative reporting from The Guardian and Cal Matters, labor reports from the Daily Journal, fintech briefs from Consumer Finance Monitor, and all the policy tracking from the Guardrail and FedScoop.
It is a dense stack of material,
Yeah.
for sure. But the through line is actually incredibly coherent once you kind of map it out.
Yeah.
We are seeing a fundamental shift in where the legal and operational liability sits in the technology stack. The liability is moving away from the foundational model providers.
Like the OpenAIs and the Anthropics?
Exactly. Away from them and away from legacy institutions. And it is landing squarely on your shoulders, the application layer.
So we are going to give you the concrete tactical playbook to navigate this bifurcated market. And to understand how to build software today, I think we have to start by looking at that foundational layer.
We have to start with what didn't happen.
Right. We need to talk about what didn't happen at the U.S. federal level this week, because the absence of regulation is actually the biggest disruptor to your risk profile right now.
You're referring to the White House executive order on AI safety that essentially it vanished into thin air.
Literally hours before it was supposed to be signed.
Yeah.
And looking at the timeline tracked by the Guardrail and the reporting in The Guardian, the panic that precipitated this original draft was just intense. So let's wind the clock back a few weeks to Anthropic's announcement.
Right, the Claude Mythos model.
Yeah. They teased this new frontier model called Claude Mythos, but they didn't release the weights. And they didn't open the API. They just held it back.
And their stated reasoning for holding it back was what set off all the alarm bells across Washington and London and Beijing.
Yeah, what did they actually say?
Well, Anthropic cited severe safety concerns, specifically regarding the model's emergent ability to autonomously identify and exploit zero-day vulnerabilities in computer code.
Which, okay, for anyone building enterprise software, that is a terrifying phrase. A zero-day vulnerability is a flaw in the software that the vendor doesn't even know about yet.
Right, meaning there's 0 days to fix it.
Exactly, 0 days before it can be exploited. And usually finding these requires, highly specialized human security researchers. It takes time.
But if a frontier model can ingest millions of lines of proprietary enterprise code and just autonomously flag 0 days, it's no longer just a chatbot at that point.
It's a weapon.
It becomes an automated weapon. Anthropic literally called it a reckoning for the cybersecurity industry.
Wow.
And that level of capability really spooked the intelligence community. You had governments in the UK, India, China privately expressing deep concerns that this specific architecture could be turned against financial systems or, critical infrastructure.
And it even flipped the politicians who were traditionally, like, staunchly anti-regulation. They were suddenly getting nervous.
Yeah, the policy trackers noted that J.D. Vance, who just last year was at an international summit warning against, hand-wringing about safety
Mhm.
getting in the way of American dominance.
Right, the accelerationist view.
Exactly. But suddenly he was making calls to AI executives, urging them to cooperate with the intelligence community.
Because the threat profile completely changed. We moved from worrying about, oh, AI generating deepfakes to AI autonomously dismantling the power grid's software architecture.
Right.
So, in response to this reckoning, the White House drafted a solution. And looking at the leaked text of this canceled order, it was essentially designed as a massive mandatory federal bottleneck.
It was a very structured pause.
Yeah.
The draft executive order outlined a 90-day vetting regime for any frontier AI model exceeding a certain compute threshold,
Before it could be deployed publicly.
right before public release. And this wasn't just a self-assessment checklist. The mechanics of this vetting process were incredibly heavy.
How heavy are we talking?
Well, it involved the National Security Agency conducting classified red team evaluations of the models, the NSA. Furthermore, the Treasury Department was mandated to set up strict information sharing agreements between these AI companies and cybersecurity defenders in critical infrastructure sectors, so specifically finance, healthcare, and energy.
The technical implementation of that would be fascinating to watch. It sounds like the government was trying to build this secure sandbox, like a way for the NSA to say, hey, let us look under the hood. Let us run adversarial attacks against your model's code generation capabilities before you put this engine on the open market via an API.
It would have fundamentally altered the go-to-market motion for foundational model providers.
Yeah, it would slow everything down.
Completely. It formalized a cooperative, almost quasi-nationalized relationship, bringing in agencies like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agencies, CISA and NIST, to define the exact technical parameters of these evaluations.
But then we hit the reversal.
The sudden stop.
Just hours before the scheduled public signing ceremony in the Oval Office, President Trump pulled the plug entirely.
Killed it completely.
Yeah.
And when speaking to reporters, his stated rationale was entirely focused on macroeconomic dominance. He said he postponed it because he, quote, didn't like certain aspects of it, explicitly framing the decision around international competition.
Right, the China dynamic.
Exactly. His quote was, we're leading China, and I don't want to do anything that's going to get in the way of that lead. He also pointed to the massive capital expenditures in the space, noting that AI is bringing in tremendous numbers of jobs and infrastructure investments. He basically refused to let a regulatory bottleneck slow that momentum.
But if we look at the Guardian's investigative piece, there is this massive inside baseball backstory regarding why that perspective shifted so rapidly in those final 24 hours.
The lobbying effort.
The lobbying effort was unprecedented.
It was a coordinated, high-velocity pressure campaign. And I want to pause here to be extremely clear, because as we analyze this, we are impartially tracking the geopolitical maneuvers and the domestic lobbying efforts documented in our source stack.
Yes.
We are looking at the mechanics of power. We are not endorsing the administration's deregulatory stance, nor are we taking a side on the tech industry's massive political spending.
Right, we're just reporting what the sources say.
Yeah, exactly. But if you are a B2B SaaS founder, you cannot build a reliable product roadmap without understanding the forces shaping your regulatory environment.
You have to know how the sausage is made because you're the one selling it to your enterprise clients.
Right.
So what actually happened in those final hours?
The Guardian reports that a coalition of tech billionaires and venture capitalists, including Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and former White House AI advisor David Sachs, directly engaged the administration to reverse course.
And the arguments they deployed were highly strategic, right? Like, according to the reporting, David Sachs hammered the geopolitical angle. He argued that a 90-day NSA review cycle would essentially hand China a 3-month head start on every generational model update.
Which is a very potent argument in Washington right now.
Very. And meanwhile, Musk and Zuckerberg reportedly focused on the domestic economy, warning that the order would chill venture capital investment and, hurt the U.S. advantage.
I should note that Musk boasted on X, denying the specific timing of those reports. He stated he only spoke to the president after the order was canceled.
Right.
But regardless of who called who at what exact minute, the broader financial architecture behind this pushback is the real story here.
The super PICs.
Yes. The tech industry has rapidly transitioned from being like passive political observers to becoming some of the most aggressive lobbyists in Washington. The Guardian highlights massive political action committees, specifically naming Leading the Future, which is a super PAC backed by OpenAI's Greg Brockman.
Wow.
And that PAC had amassed over $125 million, specifically to push anti-regulation, pro-acceleration policies.
So we have a highly capitalized industry successfully killing federal preclearance. The leaked draft of the cancellation even included explicit capitalized language guaranteeing it wouldn't create a mandatory governmental licensing preclearance or permitting requirement.
Right. The federal government is officially waving the green flag.
It is a return to a laissez-faire baseline. The U.S. is prioritizing speed, raw capability, and global dominance over preemptive safety reviews regarding disinformation or mass surveillance, or even the labor market disruption, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, the labor stuff is huge.
But here is where I want to challenge the conventional wisdom. Because when I talk to SaaS founders, their initial reaction to this news is almost universally relief.
They think is a win.
Yeah. They look at this and think, fantastic, the federal bottleneck is dead. OpenAI and Anthropic can ship faster, which means my downstream application gets access to better reasoning capabilities faster. No red tape, we can just build. I think that reaction represents a massive, potentially fatal miscalculation of where the risk actually sits in the tech stack right now.
Walk me through your thinking on that. Why isn't a deregulated upstream supply a pure win for the downstream developer?
Okay, let's go back to that F1 engine analogy from earlier. The federal government just told Anthropic and OpenAI that they can sell raw, hyper-capable Formula One engines to absolutely anyone via an API, and they don't have to build any safety chassis or speed limiters into that engine.
Right.
So you, the B2BS founder listening to this, you buy that engine and you drop it into your automated customer service platform or your legal document review tool. Because there is no federal safety stamp on that underlying model, you are 100% liable when that engine crashes.
You're saying the liability doesn't just evaporate because the federal government stepped back, it cascades down.
It entirely cascades down to the application layer. Think about the enterprise procurement process. If you are selling software to a Fortune 500 bank and your AI agent hallucinates, or worse, it ingests a piece of malware from a customer email, exploits a vulnerability in the bank's database using its raw coding capabilities, and leaks data, you cannot go to the bank and say, hey, don't blame me, Anthropic built the model.
The bank doesn't care. They don't have a contract with Anthropic. They have a master services agreement with you.
Exactly. You own the risk. The responsibility for security, for alignment, for output monitoring, for input sanitation, all of that sits entirely on your application layer.
Yeah.
If the foundation models aren't being vetted by the NSA, your enterprise clients are going to demand that your software architecture includes the necessary guardrails. You have to build the seatbelts.
And this is where the split-screen reality begins to really fracture.
Yeah.
Because this federal vacuum, this deliberate lack of a national standard for what constitutes a safe deployment of artificial intelligence is exactly what is triggering the aggressive reactions from individual states.
Right.
When the federal government steps back from managing the societal fallout of technology, the states step in.
Which brings us directly to California. Because if the federal government is, ignoring the macroeconomic and societal impacts of these models, California is hyper-focusing on the exact point where your software hits the real economy, which is human jobs.
This is a critical pivot in our source stack. We are looking at Governor Gavin Newsom's Executive Order N626.
Yeah.
And this is not a theoretical white paper. It is a first-of-its-kind, highly aggressive directive aimed specifically at the economic and labor impacts of AI.
So let's break down the mechanics of what Newsom actually ordered here, because it moves very fast. It's not an outright ban on AI in the workplace, right? But it is a massive, mandatory data gathering operation designed to trigger immediate policy action.
The timeline is what makes this so operationally intense for anyone building software. The order puts state agencies on a very tight 90-day clock.
90 days.
90 days. The Labor and Workforce Development Agency, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and the Department of Finance are mandated to deliver a comprehensive report on the labor market effects of AI.
And what are they looking for, specifically?
They are specifically tasked with identifying disproportionate impacts on certain demographics, lower-wage workers, and basically finding early warning signs of sector-wide disruption.
Okay. And after that 90-day sprint,
They have exactly 180 days from the signing of the order to create actionable, enforceable policy recommendations based on that data.
wow. Now, looking at the CalMatters reporting, these agencies are exploring a very wide menu of mitigation strategies. Like they are looking at state-mandated severance policies for AI displacement.
Subsidized employment transitions,
Yeah.
too.
Mandatory employer-funded job retraining, and even more radical concepts like requiring companies to offer stock compensation or transition to cooperative business ownership models for workers displaced by automation.
All of those are massive structural changes to corporate law. But the most immediate, operationally significant mechanism for the sauce founder listening to this right now
Right.
is the directive to explore revisions to the California WARN Act.
Let's dive deep into this because the WARN Act is a foundational piece of employment law, and modifying it to target software is a fascinating legal maneuver. How does the WARN Act currently function?
The Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. As it stands today, it requires large employers, generally those with 100 or more employees, to provide at least 60 days written notice to the state and to the affected workers before executing a mass layoff, a plant closure, or a major relocation.
It's an early warning system.
Exactly. It's designed to give the state time to deploy unemployment resources.
So what does Executive Order N626 actually do to it?
It directs agencies to figure out how to update those WARN Act reporting requirements to specifically track and isolate layoffs that are driven by AI and automation.
They want a new category.
They want to create a separate legal category for human displacement caused by software.
And the timing of this is incredibly specific. It didn't just happen in a vacuum. California is making this move right on the heels of a massive wave of tech layoffs where executives were explicitly citing AI as the catalyst.
Very publicly, too.
Yeah. The CalMatters piece highlights that Meta recently laid off 8,000 workers. And Mark Zuckerberg's internal memo specifically pointed to investing in AI as a reason for the restructuring. Cisco and Block did the exact same thing, very publicly swapping headcount for compute power.
And there is a deep, highly contentious political undertow here that we have to map out because it dictates just how aggressive this WARN Act revision is going to become.
Right, the union dynamic.
Yes. The friction between organized labor and the tech industry in California has reached an absolute boiling point. Last fall, Governor Newsom vetoed a piece of legislation dubbed the No Robo-Bosses Act.
Oh, I remember that.
Right, which would have legally prevented businesses from using an algorithm or an AI as the sole determining factor in firing a human being.
And organized labor was furious about that veto.
Beyond furious, they viewed it as a total betrayal. The AFL-CIO president, Liz Schuler, and Lorena Gonzalez, the head of the California Labor Federation, have essentially drawn a line in the sand.
Yeah.
The political reporting suggests they implicitly threatened to pull massive union support and funding for a potential Newsom 2028 presidential run if he didn't take executive action to protect workers from automation.
The quote from Lorena Gonzalez in CalMatters is incredibly pointed. She said, quote, "Catastrophic job loss from AI is not inevitable. It's a political choice."
Right.
They are framing automation not as, a natural technological evolution, but as a deliberate corporate action that needs to be heavily regulated and penalized.
Exactly. And on the opposing side of that ideological spectrum, you have the Silicon Valley elite.
The accelerationists again.
You have tech executives like Elon Musk and Anthropic's Dario Amodei publicly suggesting that universal basic income, or UBI, is the inevitable mathematical solution to mass automation.
Which is, their argument is basically, yes, the software will take the jobs, but the software will generate so much wealth that the state can just pay everyone a stipend to exist.
Which is an idea the labor unions vehemently, fundamentally reject.
They despise it.
They absolutely despise it. Gonzalez explicitly stated that unions are desperately opposed to UBI. Their core philosophy is that there's dignity in work and that a society functioning purely on government stipends while corporations own all the automated means of production is, frankly, a dystopia.
And again, we are entirely impartial here.
Yes, absolutely.
We are not taking a side on whether universal basic income is a utopian solution or whether strict union-backed labor protections are the right path for society.
We're just reporting what the sources outline.
Exactly. But as a business leader, you cannot afford to ignore this. This massive ideological collision is happening right now in the fifth largest economy in the world, and your software is the weapon. Both sides are pointing at each other.
So how does this macro policy fight translate into actual operational friction for the B2B SaaS pipeline?
Okay, this is where we get highly tactical. I talk to founders every single day who are building and pitching new AI agents. Maybe it's an automated outbound SDR agent or an AI accounting tool. And their pitch decks and their landing pages almost always highlight the exact same value proposition.
Cost reduction.
Always. It's always framed around cost reduction. They use phrases like headcount replacement, automating humans out of the loop, doing the work of 10 junior analysts, or drastically reducing enterprise labor costs.
And if you are using that specific marketing copy in California today, you are walking your enterprise buyers directly into a compliance minefield.
Precisely. But here is where I have to push back on the underlying logic of this regulation. Let's say I am a B2B SaaS founder. I build a tool that makes a corporate marketing team 10 times more efficient at generating campaigns.
Okay.
I don't control my client's HR department. I don't know their budget constraints. If my client decides to fire 5 junior copywriters because my tool is so good that they only need 1 senior editor to manage the output, how on earth is that my software's fault?
Yeah.
Like, how do I, as a software developer, build code to mitigate my client's WARN Act liability?
It's the central dilemma of this entire framework.
Mm-hmm.
You can't control their human resources decisions, but you must control the data and the digital paper trail your software generates surrounding those decisions.
Interesting.
Think about the mechanics of a revised WARN Act. If California amends the law to require detailed disclosures about the role of AI in a mass layoff, which the labor attorneys in the Daily Journal piece suggest is the most likely outcome of this 180-day review, your enterprise client is going to be terrified of regulatory audits.
Because they'll have to prove why they fired people.
Exactly. When they let those 5 copywriters go, the state is going to ask, did an AI replace them? And your client is going to turn to you, the vendor, and say, we need the telemetry to prove to the state exactly how this tool is functioning in our workflow.
So it stops being an HR problem and instantly becomes a data pipeline issue for the software provider.
Exactly. You have to anticipate the audit. You have to design your platform analytics to log what we might call, labor supplement tracking data.
What does that actually look like from an engineering perspective, though? Are we talking about dashboards that just track user engagement?
It's deeper than just active user metrics. You need telemetry that proves how your software interacts with human personnel on a task-by-task basis. You have to build audit trails for human agency.
Okay, so give me an example.
Like, does the AI agent require a human in the loop to click approve before a financial transaction is sent? Does the software automatically route edge cases or low-confidence outputs to a human supervisor?
So you are basically logging API calls that demonstrate human oversight.
Yes. You need to build the reporting tools that allow your client to export a clean log, hand it to a state regulator, and say, look, this wasn't robo-firing.
Yeah.
We can automate the department out of existence. Here is the interaction log proving that the AI is acting as an assistive tool closely managed by our remaining staff.
That requires a massive shift in product design. You are engineering compliance features to protect your client from their own layoffs. And tactically, it means you have to completely pivot your marketing positioning. Like, you have to scrub headcount reduction from your vocabulary today.
Absolutely.
You must aggressively rebrand as workflow amplification or human-in-the-loop scaling or a co-pilot architecture. Because if you sell it as a job killer in California, you are essentially selling a WARN Act violation in a box.
And while California is hyper-focused on the economic footprint of your application, who it hires and who it fires, Europe is coming at this from an entirely different, incredibly technical vector.
Right, the code itself.
They are fundamentally rewriting the timeline and the engineering requirements for how you structure the code itself.
Which brings us to the European Union's AI Act Omnibus Agreement. If California is a political minefield, the EU AI Act is just a masterclass in complex, highly technical regulatory engineering.
It really is. So on May 7th, the EU Council and the Parliament reached a provisional political agreement on a simplification package dubbed Omnibus the 7th.
Omnibus 7th, okay.
Now, to set the context, the original massive EU AI Act officially entered into force in August 2024. For the past 2 years, the compliance dates rolling out of that act have been this looming, terrifying cliff for the software industry.
Everyone's been dreading it.
Right. What the Omnibus the 7th agreement did was completely reshuffle that timeline.
And the Fisher-Phillips legal memo, along with that deep dive analysis from Echelon Cyber, both point out that this timeline reshuffle offers a massive, desperately needed breather in one specific area, but sets a very dangerous compressed trap in another.
Yes.
Let's start by looking at the breather.
Okay, the breather applies specifically to standalone high-risk AI systems. Under the framework of the Act, these are classified as NX3 systems.
So what falls under NX3?
We are talking about software used for critical societal functions. Automated human resources screening, algorithmic credit scoring for loan approvals, workplace performance evaluation tools, biometric identification systems.
The heavy stuff.
The heavy stuff. Originally, full compliance for these high-risk systems was set to be enforced in August 2026.
Meaning you had to have your quality management systems perfectly aligned and certified by then.
Right. But the omnibus agreement pushes that enforcement cliff back 16 months to December 2, 2027.
And if your AI is embedded into a regulated physical product, say a medical device or heavy industrial machinery, that deadline is pushed even further back, all the way to August 2028.
Exactly.
What was the mechanism behind this delay, though? Like, why did the EU blink?
Extreme, sustained pressure from industry groups and heavy manufacturing member states, particularly Germany.
Germany, of course.
Yeah. Manufacturers were facing an absolute nightmare of duplicative compliance. Imagine you build an AI-powered MRI machine. You were looking at a scenario where you had to comply with both the new AI Act and the existing incredibly dense sectoral medical device regulations.
That sounds like a paperwork nightmare.
It was, and in many cases, the technical reporting requirements actually contradicted each other. The omnibus clears that up by clarifying that machinery and medical products only need to comply with their specific sectoral safety rules for now.
But there is an underlying, much more practical reason for this delay, which the Echelon cyber analysis highlights, and honestly, reading this blew my mind.
Oh, the standards issue.
Yes. As of this week in May 2026, there are literally 0 published harmonized standards for the EU AI Act.
0. It is an astonishing regulatory failure.
Wait, hold on. Let me just pause on this. They are threatening existential fines for noncompliance, but the actual technical grading rubric hasn't even been written yet.
That is correct.
How does a lawyer even advise a client on that? How does an engineer build to it?
They can't. That's the problem. In European Union law, the system relies on harmonized standards created by bodies like CEN and CNELEC.
Right.
If your software follows a published, officially recognized standard, you get what is called presumption of conformity. It's a legal safe harbor. You can prove you did it right. But the core technical standard for AI quality management systems, known as Pre-EN 192A6, is still sitting in draft form.
So thousands of companies were barreling toward an August 2026 compliance deadline, being told to completely overhaul their software architecture to comply with a law where the technical specifications didn't exist.
Exactly.
That is genuine regulatory malpractice. So this 16-month delay to December 2027 is essentially the EU admitting they just need time for the standards bodies to actually write the rules.
Precisely. It prevents a total collapse of the European enterprise software market. But here is where we transition to the trap.
Oh, right, because they didn't delay everything.
No, because not every part of the AI Act got delayed. The EU did not grant a breather across the board.
And this is where B2B SaaS founders need to pay extremely close attention because your product roadmap is about to hit a brick wall.
The transparency obligations specifically targeting generative AI, so chatbots, synthetic text generators, deepfake avatars, AI-generated audio and video, those did not get a 16-month extension.
No.
In fact, the grace period for implementing technical transparency measures got compressed. The hard, non-negotiable deadline for full compliance is now December 2, 2026.
Just months away.
Just months away.
That is a staggering operational dichotomy. If I am building an AI tool that autonomously screens, resumes, and determines who gets a job, a fundamentally high-risk application, I have until late 2027 to figure out my compliance. But if I am building a marketing sauce that generates synthetic blog posts or, I don't know, AI video avatars for training modules, I have to have machine-readable watermarks fully integrated into my data pipeline by this December.
Exactly. And let's explain the technical mechanics of that, because machine-readable watermarks isn't just a UI feature. You can't just put a little translucent logo in the corner of a video.
Right. The regulation requires cryptographic provenance.
Yes. For images and video, it means adopting standards like C2PA, where the metadata detailing the AI model used, the generation timestamp, and the origin is cryptographically bound to the file itself.
So it's baked in.
Baked in. If someone alters the file, the watermark breaks, proving it was tampered with. That requires building a whole new cryptographic signing infrastructure into your export pipeline.
And watermarking text is even harder. Like with an image, you can manipulate invisible pixels or metadata. How do you watermark a paragraph of synthetic marketing copy?
It's incredibly difficult.
You have to manipulate the statistical distribution of the tokens, the specific word choices the LLM makes, so that an algorithmic detector can recognize a hidden pattern in the phrasing without making the text sound unnatural to a human reader.
Right.
It is a massive, computationally expensive engineering challenge, and you have until December to deploy it.
And the Omnibus Agreement added an immediate, brand-new prohibition that caught the entire industry off guard. As of that exact same date, December 2, 2026, there is a total outright ban on AI systems used to generate non-consensual sexual or intimate imagery, NCII, and child sexual abuse material, CSAM.
To be clear, the penalties for violating these prohibited practices under the AI Act are devastating. It's not a slap on the wrist. We are talking about fines under 35 million euros or 7% of your global annual turnover, whichever is higher.
It is an existential, company-ending fine.
Yeah.
And this is why the analyst at Echelon makes a very strong, urgent point. If you look at the 16-month delay for high-risk systems and treat it as a regulatory vacation, you are making a massive strategic error.
But I have to ask the tactical question, though.
Okay.
If I am a mid-sized B2B SaaS founder, and the technical standards for high-risk compliance don't even exist yet, and the generative AI rules are this complex, isn't the smart operational play just to wait and see?
No?
Like, why spend precious engineering cycles and runway building compliance infrastructure against a target that is literally still moving?
Because the wait-and-see strategy fundamentally ignores the reality of how enterprise procurement works. First of all, the December 2026 transparency deadline for content generation is locked in. If your product generates any synthetic output, you can't wait.
Sure.
But more importantly, you have to look at the finalized text of Article 25.4 of the AI Act. This article dictates how the burden of compliance cascades down the software supply chain.
Explain the mechanics of that cascade. How does liability travel from the enterprise buyer down to the SaaS vendor?
Okay, if you are selling software to a massive enterprise in Europe, say a German automaker, or a French bank under the Act, that enterprise is legally classified as the deployer of the AI system.
Okay.
To meet their own compliance obligations and avoid those 35 million euro fines, they have to conclusively prove the provenance and safety of the AI models they are deploying.
Right.
Article 25.4 essentially mandates that they cannot legally use your software unless your vendor contract includes explicit, legally binding clauses detailing technical capability access, data provenance, and transparency guarantees.
Ah, so the enterprise buyer is going to audit me, the SaaS provider, long before they even sign the master services agreement.
Exactly. The compliance friction shifts left into the sales cycle.
Yeah.
You have to map your AI vendors today. If your SaaS application is basically a wrapper around an API from a foundation model like OpenAI or Anthropic, you need to know exactly what transparency guarantees and watermarking capabilities that upstream provider offers.
Because you have to pass those guarantees on in writing to your European customer.
Right. If you wait until the standards are finalized in late 2027 to start figuring this out, you will have already been locked out of the European procurement cycle for an entire year. Enterprise procurement teams will just refuse to take on the legal risk of integrating non-compliant software.
Okay, there's one piece of genuinely good news in the EU section of our source stack, specifically for smaller companies who are panicking right now.
Yes, the exemptions.
Right. The Omnibus Agreement expanded the criteria for who gets regulatory relief.
Previously, the AI Act offered simplified documentation requirements and priority access to regulatory testing sandboxes, but those benefits were strictly reserved for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises.
And what does that mean in the EU?
In the EU, that generally means companies with under 250 employees. But the new Omnibus Agreement officially extends some of these vital exemptions to a new category: small mid-caps.
The technical thresholds here are critical for our listeners.
Sure.
To qualify as a small mid-cap, you must have up to 750 employees and up to 150 million euros in annual revenue.
That's a huge bracket.
It is. If you fall into that bracket, you are now legally allowed to use simplified technical documentation requirements when proving compliance.
And in the context of EU bureaucracy, simplified documentation is a massive reduction in legal overhead. It means you don't need a 50-person compliance department to sell software in Europe.
It is a vital competitive advantage. It allows mid-market SaaS companies to scale in Europe and actually compete against entrenched enterprise incumbents who have the capital to absorb massive compliance costs.
So if we pull back and look at the split screen of our deep dive so far,
It's a lot.
it is. The U.S. federal government has washed its hands of frontier model safety, effectively dumping the entire security and alignment liability onto your application layer.
Yeah.
California's breathing down your neck, demanding telemetry on how your software impacts human headcount to enforce the WARN Act.
And Europe is demanding that you cryptographically watermark every piece of synthetic media you generate by December, while forcing you to rewrite your vendor contracts to guarantee supply chain data provenance.
It is a landscape that requires extreme tactical agility.
It sounds like an absolute regulatory vice grip. Like, why would anyone want to build software in this environment?
Right.
But this is where the split screen gets truly wild. Because while all of those regulatory walls are closing in on the application layer, there is one highly lucrative sector where the U.S. federal government is aggressively, deliberately tearing the walls down.
The fintech space.
Yes, they are actively encouraging B2B SaaS companies to completely bypass legacy gatekeepers.
And this brings us to the final major shift in our source stack, the May 19th Financial Tech Executive Order. If you are building anywhere in the fintech space, or if you're building autonomous AI agents that handle transactions, this is the holy grail.
It really is a paradigm shift. So let's look at the text of the order. The White House issued an executive order titled Integrating Financial Technology Innovation into Regulatory Frameworks. And the explicit stated goal is to remove overly burdensome and fragmented regulations that primarily serve to protect incumbent legacy financial services firms from technological competition.
They are directly targeting the regulatory moat that protects the old guard banking system.
Directly. The order gives federal financial regulators, so the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the FDIC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the NCUA. It gives them just 90 days to conduct a sweeping review.
90 days, again, is so fast for federal agencies.
Extremely fast. They must identify any rules that unduly impede fintechs from entering into partnerships with regulated institutions. And then they have 180 days to actually take concrete steps to encourage that innovation.
That alone is massive for embedded finance platforms. But the true prize, the absolute game changer in this executive order, is directed at the Federal Reserve Board.
Yes. The executive order officially requests that the Federal Reserve Board conduct a 120-day evaluation of the framework governing access to Federal Reserve Bank payment accounts and payment services.
The master accounts.
The master accounts. And it explicitly asks them to evaluate granting this direct access to, quote, uninsured depository institutions and non-bank financial companies, including those engaged in digital assets.
Okay, for anyone listening who isn't deep in the plumbing of the global financial system, we need to explain why a Federal Reserve master account is such a coveted asset.
Definitely.
Because traditionally, tech companies don't interface with the Fed.
Right. Why not just use a traditional sponsor bank like fintechs have always done, like Stripe partners with Wells Fargo or Goldman Sachs, right? Why go through the monumental effort of changing that architecture?
Because the sponsor bank model introduces massive operational and financial friction. Think about how the plumbing actually works. When a SaaS company uses a sponsor bank, they're essentially renting the bank's regulatory license to access the core U.S. payment rails.
Systems like Fedwire for real-time gross settlement or the ACH network for batch transfers.
Exactly. You are a tenant in their financial house. And for that privilege, the sponsor bank exacts a heavy toll. First, they take a cut of the margin on every single transaction.
Which kills your unit economics at scale.
It does. Second, they introduce latency into the settlement process because your API call has to hit their servers, get validated against their internal risk models, and then be batched and sent to the Fed.
So it's not truly real time.
No. And third, they impose their own massive compliance bottlenecks on your software. If the sponsor bank gets nervous about a new AI feature you just rolled out, they can literally shut off your access to the financial system overnight.
Wow. So if a B2B fintech SaaS successfully secures a master account under this new framework,
they cut out the middleman entirely. Direct access to a master account allows a non-bank technology entity to settle funds directly on the core U.S. ledger.
that's huge.
It fundamentally transitions a SaaS company from just being a software wrapper sitting on top of a legacy bank to being a primary Tier 1 financial actor itself.
Imagine the product implications of that unlock. Let's say your product roadmap includes autonomous AI underwriting. Or imagine you are building an AI treasury management agent that autonomously moves corporate capital across different assets to optimize yield, like minute by minute.
Okay.
Having to route every single one of those microtransactions through a legacy sponsor bank's API is a nightmare. The latency and the margin sharing completely destroy the ROI of the autonomous agent.
Right, it doesn't work.
But if your AI agent can tap straight into the Federal Reserve settlement ledger via a master account, you can execute autonomous financial clearance in real time, at scale, with virtually zero counterparty margin loss.
It is the ultimate unlock for autonomous
It
finance.
is.
And there is recent precedent for this vault finally cracking open. The Sullivan and Cromwell legal memo notes that the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City recently approved a limited purpose account for Kraken Financial.
The crypto exchange.
Right. Now, it came with incredibly strict controls. They are not allowed intraday credit, and they do not receive interest on their balances. But it proved the concept. It proved that a non-traditional digital asset-focused technology firm could gain direct access to the Fed's plumbing.
But there have been massive, protracted legal battles over this, right? The so-called Tier 3 institutions have been fighting for this access for years.
Yes, the Fed's guidelines categorize applicants into tiers. Tier 3 institutions are legally eligible entities that are not federally insured and are not subject to traditional federal banking supervision.
So the pure fintech and crypto players?
Exactly. Firms like Custodia Bank in Wyoming have been fighting the Federal Reserve in federal court for years after having their master account applications denied. What this new executive order does is essentially have the White House put its heavy thumb on the scale.
They're pushing the Fed.
The administration is demanding that the Fed establish transparent, predictable application procedures and make definitive determinations within 90 days if they find they have the legal authority to grant this access. They want to force the Fed's hand.
Now, earlier we promised strict impartiality, and we need to apply that here too, because the reactions to this fintech executive order are, frankly, starkly divided.
Oh, absolutely.
Looking at the brief from the Consumer Finance Monitor, the battle lines are clearly drawn.
The division is incredibly intense. On one side, consumer advocacy groups like the National Consumer Law Center, or NCLC, are raising massive alarms. They are fundamentally opposed to this deregulation.
Because they think it's dangerous for consumers.
Right. They argue this order will actively promote predatory rent-a-bank lending schemes.
Explain the mechanism of that fear. Like, why does direct access lead to predatory lending?
The fear is that non-bank tech lenders will use these new federal partnerships to entirely evade state-level consumer protection laws, specifically state interest rate caps. The NCLC warns this could lead to SaaS platforms aggressively pushing algorithmic loan products with APRs over 100%, immune from state regulation.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, they view allowing uninsured digital asset platforms direct access to the Fed ledger as exposing consumers and the broader macro-financial system to severe systemic operational risk. If a massive tech platform collapses and is directly wired into the Fed, the contagion could be catastrophic.
And on the other side of the argument,
Industry lobbying groups like the American Fintech Council are applauding the EO loudly. They argue that breaking down these legacy barriers is a critical overdue step for fostering true market competition.
cutting transaction costs.
Exactly. Their stance is that cutting out the sponsor banks will drastically lower transaction costs for everyday consumers, and it is the only way to ensure the U.S. remains at the forefront of global financial innovation against competitors in Asia and Europe.
Again, we're impartially outlining both of these systemic arguments without taking a position.
We are just looking at the forces at play.
Right. But operationally, as a founder, the momentum from the executive branch is clearly favoring the innovation and deregulation side of the argument right now.
Yes, it is.
So what does this all mean? Let's pull all of these threads together and synthesize this completely fractured, split-screen reality we've been unpacking for the last hour.
It's a lot to process.
It is. As a B2B SaaS founder, the ground beneath your feet has fundamentally shifted this week.
In the United States, you are looking at a hyper-deregulated baseline for foundational technology. The federal government has explicitly decided not to act as a bottleneck for frontier AI model deployment.
Which is great for speed.
Great for speed. But because they have actively abdicated that safety role, the entire burden of security, alignment, output monitoring, and enterprise liability falls squarely on your application layer. The F1 engine is free, but you are legally responsible for building the seatbelts.
Simultaneously, that exact same deregulatory impulse in the U.S. is actively attempting to dismantle the legacy banking moat. It is opening up a narrow 90 to 120-day window where your fintech SaaS might finally gain direct frictionless access to core settlement ledgers, bypassing the friction of sponsor banks entirely.
But the moment your software crosses a state line into California or a digital border into Europe, the physics of the market change violently.
Violently.
California is demanding that you engineer advanced telemetry to track every human job your software disrupts, effectively weaponizing the WARN Act against the concept of algorithmic automation.
And UP has set a hard, technologically punishing, and completely non-negotiable deadline of December 2026. Every piece of synthetic generative media your pipeline produces must be cryptographically watermarked.
And your entire suite of vendor contracts must be rewritten to legally guarantee supply chain data provenance, or you will be entirely locked out of the enterprise procurement market.
It is a landscape that requires extreme tactical agility. You have to build fast enough to capture the U.S. deregulatory upside while engineering deep compliance architectures to survive the European and Californian traps.
Which is exactly why we always end this deep dive with the Friday action checklist.
Based on the dense stack of legal and technical sources we covered today, here's exactly what you need to audit with your engineering and legal teams before you log off for the weekend.
Item 1. Audit your model provenance and export architecture. Ensure your generative text, audio, or video pipeline has an active technical track for injecting C2PA or statistical machine-readable watermarks.
You must be ready for that December 2026 EU transparency deadline.
Item 2. Check your headcount and your trailing revenue. If your company sits between 250 and 750 employees and generates under 150 million euros in revenue, immediately update your EU AI Act risk classifications with your legal counsel.
You now qualify for the new mid-cap exemptions under Omnibus 7th, which will save you massive amounts of compliance overhead.
Item 3. Review your third-party tender contracts. In strict alignment with the new Article 25(4) of the EU text, ensure your master services agreements with upstream foundational models explicitly detail technical capability access and guarantee data provenance.
You cannot sell to a European enterprise without these contractual guarantees passing through your stack.
And finally, Item 4. Prepare client-side disclosures for workforce automation.
If your B2B tool touches HR data, or if your core value proposition is workflow displacement, you need to design the telemetry dashboards now. Build the API logs that prove human-in-the-loop oversight.
You must prepare your enterprise clients for California's impending WARN Act labor tracking mandates, or they will simply stop using your software.
It is a massive engineering burden, but the founders who build these compliance features into their core architecture today will absolutely dominate the enterprise procurement cycles next year.
We started this deep dive talking about the impossible liability of building a nuclear reactor in your garage. The reality is, as a software founder today, you don't get the luxury of waiting for the regulatory authorities to agree on a single set of blueprints. You have to build the ship while navigating a global storm.
And the collision of these opposing regulatory frameworks, the U.S. acceleration versus the European and Californian deceleration, isn't just a theoretical possibility. It is an absolute operational inevitability.
Which leaves us with one final highly provocative scenario for you to mull over as you sit down with your product roadmaps next week.
Imagine it is late next year. Empowered by this new U.S. executive order, your autonomous AI fintech agent successfully executes a massive, high-yield financial clearance directly on the Federal Reserve ledger, entirely bypassing a traditional bank.
It is a massive technical triumph.
But what happens when that exact same autonomous agent generates the synthetic financial reporting documents for your European enterprise client, and those documents lack the required December 2026 cryptographic watermarks?
And what happens when, in the process of flawlessly automating that workflow, your software eliminates an entire corporate accounting department based in San Francisco, instantly triggering a massive California WARN Act violation audit?
The United States gave you the raw engine. Europe fined you 35 million euros for the exhaust, and California sued you for the destination.
Are your data pipelines ready for that collision?